In the winter of 1788, France looked powerful from the outside. It was the largest kingdom in Europe. Its population was growing. Its armies were still feared. Paris remained the cultural capital of the continent. From Versailles, the monarchy appeared unshaken. But inside the state's own ledgers, the numbers told a different story. France was not poor, it was insolvent. Government officials were no longer arguing about reform. They were arguing about survival. Payments were delayed. Creditors were nervous. Treasury reports contradicted each other. No one could say with confidence how much money the state actually had, only how much it owed. By 1788, the French crown could no longer borrow at reasonable rates. Lenders demanded guarantees that the government could not give. Short-term loans replaced long-term funding. Emergency measures became routine. The state was living week to week. This is where the French Revolution really began, not with mobs, not with slogans, but with unpaid bills. To understand why France reached this point, you have to separate France the country from France the state, because the problem was not wealth, it was access. France was one of the richest societies in Europe. Land was productive. Trade was active. Luxury goods flowed through Paris and provincial cities alike. Wealth existed everywhere except in the treasury. The tax system of the ancien regime was not designed to collect efficiently. It was designed to preserve privilege. Taxes differed by region, by class, by historical exemption. Some provinces paid one rate, others another. Some estates paid nothing at all. Nobles and clergy, the largest landowners, were shielded from direct taxation. Their contributions were symbolic, negotiated, or entirely absent. The burden fell on those least able to carry it. Peasants paid land taxes, consumption taxes, labor obligations, and local levies. Urban workers paid indirect taxes embedded in basic goods. Salt, bread, wine, all taxed. Every transaction reminded ordinary people that the state reached them easily, but spared others. And even this unequal system was not fully controlled by the crown. Much of France's revenue was collected by private tax farmers. These men paid the state a fixed sum in advance, then extracted as much as they could from the population. Anything beyond the contract was theirs to keep. Abuse was not a flaw, it was the incentive. For the monarchy, this provided short-term certainty. For the economy, it created long-term damage. Money was lost to inefficiency, corruption, and resistance. Entire regions became undercollected or over-extracted. The system generated resentment but not revenue. Even in good years, the treasury struggled. In bad years, it collapsed. This meant the state lived permanently on credit. Every war exposed the weakness. France fought often, and war was expensive. Armies had to be supplied. Navies had to be built. Fortifications maintained. None of this could be funded through reform, because reform meant confronting privilege. So the crown borrowed. Loans replaced taxes. Debt replaced reform. As long as lenders believed the system could be fixed someday, credit flowed. Interest rates remained manageable. The illusion of solvency survived, but debt accumulates silently. By the 1770s, interest payments consumed an enormous portion of state revenue. The crown was no longer borrowing to build or invest. It was borrowing to pay previous loans. Each new issue narrowed the future. Finance ministers came and went. Each one saw the same problem. Each proposed the same solution. Tax the privileged. Centralize collection, modernize revenue. Each failed. The nobility resisted. The clergy resisted. The parliament's regional courts, dominated by elites, blocked reform by refusing to register new taxes. They framed resistance as defense of liberty against royal overreach. Privilege became principle. The monarchy backed down again and again. France was caught in a structural contradiction. The state had authority but not capacity. It had power but not reach. It ruled a wealthy society through a broken fiscal machine. By the late 1780s, the consequences were visible everywhere. Treasury officials delayed payments. Contractors demanded cash up front. Soldiers were paid late. Grain shortages worsened unrest. Rumors of bankruptcy circulated openly. Creditors began to doubt not just the crown's willingness to reform, but its ability to survive. Interest rates rose. New loans shrank. Emergency measures multiplied. The margin for error disappeared. France was no longer managing debt. Debt was managing France. The monarchy still appeared absolute. But financially, it was cornered. The system could not continue. Something had to give. The crown had avoided reform for generations. Now reform was unavoidable and politically explosive. The next decision would not just determine fiscal survival. It would decide who truly ruled France. The moment that sealed France's fate arrived, not with rebellion, but with a decision made in silence. In the 1770s, as the French treasury weakened, the monarchy chose war. France would intervene in the American War of Independence. Officially, it was about liberty and revenge against Britain. Unofficially, it was about restoring prestige and power after earlier defeats. Victory would reassert France's position as a great power. Influence would be regained. Confidence would return. The cost was treated as a future problem. The war was not funded through new taxes. No privileges were challenged. No exemptions removed. The state did not even pretend to reform its revenue system. Instead, it borrowed massively. War loans poured in, bonds were issued, credit expanded. Case expanded on paper, the system held together. On the battlefield, France won. Britain was weakened. Gamble seemed justified. But when the war ended, the accounts were brutal. Debt had exploded. Interest payments now consumed a crushing share of state revenue. In some years, more than half of all income was spent servicing past loans. The crown was no longer financing government. It was financing debt. This was the turning point. The state could not borrow its way out anymore. Credit had become the system itself. Every new loan was smaller, shorter, and more expensive. Lenders demanded guarantees. Confidence began to fray. Finance ministers knew exactly what had to be done. Solution was obvious. Tax reform, not minor adjustments. Structural change. Privileged estates would have to pay. The tax system would need to be unified. Collection would need to be centralized. The state would need to reach wealth instead of skimming poverty. Each attempt followed the same pattern. A proposal would be drafted. It would circulate quietly. Elite resistance would form. The parliaments would refuse registration. Public conflict would erupt. Time after time, the cycle repeated. Ministers warned the king that bankruptcy was approaching. Memoranda described the danger in stark terms. Charts showed debt curves bending upward. Projections demonstrated that without reform, default was inevitable. The response was hesitation. Every reform attempt threatened the political foundation of the monarchy. The crown relied on elite cooperation to govern. Taxing them meant confrontation. Confrontation meant instability. Instability meant revolt. So the crown chose delay. Borrowing resumed. This is the reform trap. Debt made reform urgent. Reform made debt politically dangerous. Avoiding reform required more debt. The loop tightened. In the late 1780s, the system was breaking down. Poor harvests reduced tax intake. Bread prices rose sharply. Urban unrest increased. Meanwhile, the cost of borrowing surged. Creditors began to doubt whether reform would ever occur. They were right. In 1788, the Treasury faced a reality it could no longer disguise. The state could not raise taxes. It could not borrow. It could not reduce spending without collapsing administration. It could not even reliably pay interest on existing loans. France was out of time. The monarchy faced a decision it had postponed for generations: admit the crisis publicly, or allow the state to default in silence. It chose admission. To restore confidence, the crown summoned the Estates General, an assembly that had not met since 1614. This was not an act of generosity or reformist zeal. It was a financial necessity. Only a body representing the nation could authorize new taxes and convince creditors to lend again. But in making this choice, the monarchy crossed a line it could never uncross. By calling the Estates General, the crown acknowledged that its authority had limits. Absolute power was replaced by negotiation. Fiscal necessity forced constitutional exposure. The debt crisis had escaped the balance sheet. Once representatives gathered, they did not see a temporary emergency. They saw a system designed to protect privilege at the expense of survival. The Third Estate understood immediately that the problem was not overspending, it was structure. Debt had become political. The crown had invited the nation into the problem. The nation began asking questions the monarchy could not answer. Why should those who paid nothing decide everything? Why should reform always be delayed? Why should survival depend on permission? The financial crisis had become a legitimacy crisis. And legitimacy, once questioned, does not return quietly. By the time negotiations stalled, the outcome was no longer about money. It was about power. The inability to reform the tax system had exposed the inability to rule without consent. The debt had done what armies could not. It had broken the political system open. Once the Estates General met in 1789, the financial crisis escaped the Crown's control completely. The Assembly had been called to approve taxes. Instead, it exposed the structure that had made taxation impossible. Representatives of the Third Estate, merchants, lawyers, professionals, landholders, did not see a temporary shortage of funds. They saw a system designed to protect privilege while demanding sacrifice from everyone else. The debt crisis stripped the monarchy of its final defense. For decades, the crown had ruled through tradition, secrecy, and delay. Now everything was public. Accounts were discussed openly. Privilege was named. Inequality was quantified. The language of finance became the language of legitimacy. If the state could not function without consent, then consent would redefine the state. When negotiations stalled, the Third Estate acted. It declared itself the National Assembly. This was not a revolutionary impulse born of ideology. It was a practical response to insolvency. If the old system could not pay, it could not command. Authority fractured. At the same time, the financial machinery of the state ground down. Credit was already exhausted. Tax collection slowed as unrest spread. Officials hesitated. Orders were delayed. Soldiers went unpaid. Grain shortages worsened conditions in cities and towns. Confidence collapsed at every level. The storming of the Bastille came weeks later, but by then the revolution was already irreversible. The fortress fell because the state behind it had already failed financially. Overt command chains broke. Power no longer flowed smoothly from the center. Money had stopped performing its basic function. As the old regime dissolved, the new authorities inherited the same problem that had destroyed it, an empty treasury. Wars, unrest, and administrative collapse had annihilated revenue. Yet the state still had to function. Armies had to be paid. Food had to be purchased. Authority had to be asserted. The solution was once again financial. Church lands were seized and converted into backing for a new paper currency. The assignats were issued as a temporary measure, a bridge between collapse and stability. At first, they worked. Trade resumed. Confidence returned. The revolution appeared to have solved the problem that had destroyed the monarchy, but the temptation returned with the relief. More assignats were printed. Short-term necessity replaced long-term restraint. Inflation followed. Prices rose. Savings evaporated. The revolution that had begun as a debt crisis now faced a monetary crisis of its own. The pattern repeated itself. Political collapse followed financial collapse. Financial shortcuts produced political consequences. The French Revolution did not begin because people suddenly desired liberty. It began because the state could no longer fund itself under the rules it had created. Debt exposed inequality. Insolvency exposed illegitimacy. And legitimacy, once broken, cannot be repaired with force. This is the part of the story that survives France. States rarely fall because people become angry. Anger is constant. States fall when money stops moving. A government that cannot tax fairly cannot borrow sustainably. A government that cannot borrow loses authority. And when authority dissolves, politics rushes in to replace administration. Debt crises force reform, blocked reform forces crisis. And crisis invites transformation.
Oh.
The French monarchy did not choose revolution. It postponed reform and filled the gap with credit. Debt delayed the reckoning until it accelerated it. This is why fiscal systems matter more than ideology. A tax system that cannot adapt will eventually break the state that depends on it. War accelerates the process. Credit disguises it. But nothing escapes it. France did not fall because it lacked ideas. It fell because it lacked revenue. The revolution began not with a cry for liberty, but with a balance sheet that no longer balanced. Once the state asked permission to survive, it discovered that survival came with conditions. And once those conditions were named, the old order could not return. This is how financial collapse becomes political transformation. Not suddenly, not accidentally, but inevitably.